Hello, everyone. Welcome to Doing Sociology. Today, we have with us Professor Ankur Datta, who teaches in South Asian University. He has an MA in Social Anthropology from the School of Oriental and African Studies and a PhD in Social Anthropology from the London School of Economics. His research interests lie in Kashmir studies, history and memory, post-migration, violence and conflict, and social anthropology and ethnography. His recent publication is titled On Uncertain Ground, a study of displaced Kashmiri Pandits in Jammu and Kashmir, which was published by the OUP, Oxford University Press. We welcome you, sir. He is going to be our first speaker for our newly launched series, what is Ethnography, where we are trying to familiarize students with ethnography as a research method. And this will also be part of our series Interview with Academics. We welcome you, sir, to Doing Sociology, and thank you so much for taking the time out. Welcome, sir.
Rituparna, thank you. Deepali, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you guys. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah. So to begin our discussion, I wanted to know that, do you think that what can make a distinction between place and space in sociological literature,
yes,
particularly, in reference to your work on forced migrant camps?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. Well, I'm actually more concerned with the element of place and space in the sense that there's a classic way of looking at place and space as related concepts, but one sees a space as something physical, as something that's given. My interest then hence would come with place, which is when we start looking at what gives a space meaning, what gives a space some kind of distinctiveness. And of course, an interest in place means that one is not simply looking at place as something given, but to see it as the outcome of a series of processes. In other words, I'm looking at place making. And anybody doing any scholar, not just in anthropology, not just in sociology, but if you're looking at ethnographic work, we're concerned not so much, we're concerned with place as a given site that is meaningful, but also place is something that people keep working towards and keep making. Now, in terms of the question of the camp, I think it's very interesting to think about this question. What kind of place is a camp? At one level, the camp is fairly ubiquitous in our imagination, right? When we think of forced migrants, when we think of refugees, when we even think about extreme politics, we are aware of what a camp is. You have refugee camps, but you also had concentration camps. You think of Auschwitz, you think of the Stalinist gulags, and so on and so forth. So when we think about the camp as a place now, say in 2020, it's a place we are actually quite familiar with, regardless of the position we're in, whether we're in anthropology, sociology, whether in literary studies, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing about the camp as a formation, as a formalized formation, to a great extent, seems to come out in the aftermath of the Second World War, all right? When you had, in fact, actually the end of the Second World War, when, was followed by the formation of, the rights of the refugee, the framing of the refugee as a legally identified identity. It comes out of the awareness that, you had places like Auschwitz, the death camp in that sense, which we saw. Which doesn't mean that one had to wait until the Second World War for camps. I mean, the first concentration camp goes back to the Anglo-Boer Wars in South Africa, which is, I think, end 19th, early 20th century, about somewhere between 1898 to 1902. I can't remember the exact date. But the understanding of a camp starts to emerge in this aftermath. And this is something the anthropologist Lisa Malki, whose own work, Purity in Exile, it's one of the best. It's a seminal text in the study of refugees, especially for anthropologists. As Lisa Malki points out in a series of other essays, one starts to look at the framing and understanding of camp in terms of modern refugee studies. So if you look at people like Proudfoot, other books that came out in the aftermath of the Second World War and the management of displaced people in Europe, that gives rise to this understanding of DP camps or displaced persons camps. But having said that, there's another text which I really do recommend, which was published, I think, in 1949 or 1950 by Alexander Leighton, who was a psychiatrist, who was commissioned during the Second World War to do a study of the internment camps for Japanese Americans during the Second World War. I mean, you have these studies, and I'll just come back to that, but what I think comes out of this understanding is that the camp is a place, it's a meaningful place, it evokes a certain idea, it's a site, but it's also an instrument of governmentality. It's a site where you can put people in, but it's also an instrument of governance. And this is something, I mean, Alexander Layton's book on these internment camps was just called The Governing of Men. When I was a student, which wasn't that long ago, but when I was a student, I remember the big thing we were all reading was Giorgio Agamben. So if you did some research on a camp, Homo Sacer, you head into Agamben territory, and there's that chapter, the camp is the nomos of the modern world. And Agamben uses how Auschwitz becomes the model for governing populations of unwanted people. This again then gets taken further by scholars in humanitarian studies like Didier Fassin, who talks about how, you can build a camp in regular places. So you can turn a stadium into an internment camp for illegal immigrants, for example, right? You can turn anything into a camp. What comes out of ultimately is the camp is a site. The camp is also an instrument of governmentality, and this is something universal. And when you read Agamben, when you read Fassin, or when you go back to all this old stuff coming in the 1950s or Alexander Layton, there is a sense of the camp as being a place where you put people who don't fit into the national mainstream. These outsiders, these refugees who don't belong, we have to put them somewhere. We can't let them spread out, so we put them in the camp. So that was one model. The camp in that sense becomes a place and an instrument to contain, the odd people. But at the same time, within refugee studies, you have sociologists like Emmanuel Marx who talk about the camp as having its own kind of social life as well, right? Because the camp is a place, you have people inside. And a lot of scholars who've looked at camp populations across the world have noticed that the camp has its own kind of politics, it has its own set of relationships that emerge. Lisa Malki's work on Hutu refugees from Burundi, Julie Petit's work, Landscapes of Hope and Despair about Palestinian refugee camps, are quite phenomenal because you see these as lively places, right? And I think, and you will see this, of course, even in representations of partition refugee camps in India. And actually, if you read some of the work on partition refugee camps, say in Delhi or Calcutta, what you see is this understanding of the camp emerging in the margins of the city, and eventually they could become part of a city. So, a lot of South Calcutta was partly camp, and then it becomes incorporated into the everyday life and political economy of the city. But the distinction here comes in two ways. It is a site, and it is an instrument of governance. At the same time, though, a lot of the earlier European model, which Agamben draws on, and I like that stuff, I like the work, and I think there's a lot to learn from it. But it's premised on the death camp, right? It is premised on a model of Auschwitz. Or it's premised on the Gulag, which is a site of incarceration, to get sent to a camp in Siberia. The model which Ananya Vajpayee points out in this very interesting essay on violence in India, and it's obvious, but it still is important to reiterate, is that are we looking at the death camp or are we looking at the relief camp? And partition refugee, the partition history of camps shows that what you have in India by and large is a relief camp. It's not out to kill you. It's not out to sequester you. And you can't really control the flow of movement of populations in and out of a camp. In fact, that's why what you have is there's a framing of the camp as a space of exception. My interest when I did my own work, and when you look at the work of experiences from India, mostly, especially around the partition, is that we look at how a space of exception, this is a camp. My respondents ended up leaving homes and getting stuck in a 9x14 room with tin roofs in the summer in Jammu, which is about, same kind of weather in Delhi. It's marked off as a separate place. It is identified as this is a place for displaced people, but it acquires a life of its own. It's connected to the city by buses. One respondent would keep calling it's like a town. So the space of exception becomes ordinary. It becomes everyday. It's like how you think of these Jawardapul areas in Calcutta, for example, as well. The issue, though, is I'm not going to the full extent of the idea of the death camp as a model. And while I would talk about the place of place of exception becoming ordinary, ultimately, at the end of the day, the Kashmiri Pandit camps, for example, were shut down in 2011. So even if you built life, even if you made something like a town, it gets shut down and the population gets transferred to another site, or Jakti, which is also interesting. I haven't done a lot of work there, but it has its own dynamics. And at the same time, if you look at the work of scholars like, Moyuk Chatterjee, I think Moyuk Chatterjee or other people writing about the Gujarat riots in 2002, where relief camps were set up for a lot of the Muslims who were affected, one saw these camps as in a way being neglected by the state. So the original formation of a relief camp that's supposed to help you survive, if it doesn't do it entirely, it's due to other factors. That is also changing. So we're kind of now again in this unsteady territory right now of spaces of exception being ordinary to becoming exceptional again, even if they're not following the same model of the death camp, which Agamben talks about. How does one then talk about the camp as a meaningful place? I think that becomes a major issue. Secondly, places have an imprint on people. People have an imprint on places. It's a dynamic relationship, which you see with any kind of study in the anthropology of landscape. People like to talk about places, right? So this place means people of a certain character. So in my work, people will say, be careful when you go to the camp. It's not that nice, which is absolutely untrue. They're quite hospitable. I mean, they're quite tolerant of people visiting in and looking at them as if, as if the camp was a zoo, right? So there's that angle to it. But at the same time, the fact that the camp I did work in got shut down and transferred, but most of the population moved, shows there's still an element of the camp as an instrument of government that has to still be considered in some cases. What we are seeing now is you have the history of the partition where the camps just became part of the city. Lots of parts of Calcutta are like that, parts of Delhi are like that. But at the same time, you have these camps of these kind of displaced populations who remain dependent on the state in some ways. How does one see those? And you also have camp-like settlements that come up, which might share a lot of similarities with other kinds of settlements like slums and so on and so forth, which will lack any kind of protection. And in this case, I'm thinking about, say, Rohingya settlements. I haven't worked with the Rohingya, but if you catch up on the work and the reports that come out, that does indeed seem to be the case, which also means eventually that camps remain vulnerable spaces. A more extreme example of that would be, let's say, the Palestinian refugee camps, which became what Petit called landscapes of hope and despair. They became spaces to revitalize and kind of politics among Palestinian refugees who were expelled by during the Nakba, as they call it, or the formation of Israel and the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland. At the same time, while they became lived spaces, they were extremely vulnerable to violence. So you had the massacres of Shabra and Shatila in 1982 during the Lebanese Civil War. So that's, I guess, the puzzle. I was lucky in the sense the camp I was in. Otherwise, while there would be some tensions here and there, you didn't face that kind of violence, which you would say in Shabra and Shatila, but you faced an uncertainty because ultimately a camp is a space of temporary life. And it marks you out still as a population that's not quite there. To be displaced is, in a way, not seen as terribly normal. The normal state of being is that you're fixed in place. You're where your roots are, which in a country like India, for example, where almost migration is a fact of life, that's very hard to deal with. Yeah.
So my question to you is then, how does one understand the idea of home among forced migrants or displaced people?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. It's something I still struggle with even now. How do we see home? I'm just in general, for anybody. Do I see home in terms of a house? I mean, a built structure does help. But I mean, a lot of scholarship often points out that a built structure is one thing. It's the kind of meanings you impute to it that make it home. Now, what are the kind of things that make a house of home? It could be meaning, it could be practices, and that way home is often best understood as a site, as a locus, as a locus of certain practices, and a locus of meaning, right? You bring all these ideas together. That's what makes your home home. I'm not talking about refugees right now. It's just for anybody. I mean, sometimes it's a question of scale that comes in. One way is to say, I am going home, which is I'm going back to my flat or house. And maybe that's where my parents live, that's where my family lives, or so on and so forth. maybe as students, your hostel becomes home. You know, that's my place. My friends are there. It's a meaningful life in that sense. I got my room and I got my bed. So ultimately, in that sense, a home is also determined a lot by relationships and a possibility of some kind of life where even if it's rough, it's somewhere where I feel certain and somewhere where I feel secure. Somewhere where I feel secure. Somewhere where I know that this is my little space. It might even be just a 10 by 10 feet room, you know, but it's someplace where I feel secure, where I'm not worried. Now, with forced migration studies, there is, of course, a major discussion about home, because who is a forced migrant? And I use the term forced migrant in this sense to include refugee or displaced people, and internally displaced persons displaced by conflict or development projects and so on and so forth. There is a debate about whether forced migration actually does justice, but I'm using it as a kind of broad range of things to keep in mind. And home, one of the defining features, again, when you're thinking about forced migrants, is that you're a refugee or a displaced person because you've lost home. You've lost home. You've lost that which gives you security and some certainty. I mean, if you take, for example, the term Udvastu or Udvastu, which was used to talk about refugees in the partition era. I mean, Dipesh Chakraborty writes about this in the context of East Bengali Hindu refugees who leave what becomes East Pakistan and Bangladesh into India. He talks, the word that was used was Udvastu, which means someone who lacks a foundation. It means you don't kind of belong. So the discussion of home in forced migration studies tends to begin with, and I mean, for good reasons, it tends to begin with this idea that you are defined by the loss of home, and the rest of your life is then spent in recovering that which you lost. Now, the question is, what did you lose? Did you lose a house? Yes. You know, you could have lost a house, you could have lost property. A lot of the people I work with would say, you know, we had large 2-3 storied houses and now we're stuck in a 9 by 14 room. So there is, of course, the loss of the tangible, which becomes important. But apart from the tangible as well, it's not just a loss of that tangibility of tangible stuff, though that does become important, but it becomes a loss of relationships that made home, you know, friendships, kinships. You know, a lot of the people I worked with would say we scattered like rice. So you lost connection with others, which you helped to recover and build. It's a loss of livelihoods. That's also a major thing. Relationships, work relationships, livelihoods, loss of status as well. You know, to go from a homeowner to basically being homeless and being pushed to precarity and poverty, that makes a major difference. It's an existential dilemma as well, right? If I had a 3-storied home and now I'm basically in a crappy room, what do I do? So home becomes a loss of a range of relationships, and it is a loss of the tangible and the intangible. Home could also be a loss of homeland. So it's not just my house, it's the loss of a landscape. You know, it's a loss of a landscape I will not recover. It's a loss of a neighborhood I will not recover, which then facilitates further relationships. The way to perhaps to go forward, though, is to look at the recovery of home, or if home is not easy to recover, what are the difficulties that go in? And to see, again, like, you know, like I said earlier, place is an active process. It is about place making, right? You're actively making place. Home becomes interesting, and there's some recent scholarship which looks at not necessarily home, but homecoming, first of all, as a return home, and homemaking, that I have to keep making home. It could be in terms of building a nice little cottage. It could be maybe finding some element for lost homes and putting on my wall. And this is not peculiar to forced migrations. You'll see this with a lot of migrants. But it could also be trying to recover home in terms of certain practices as well. Whether it's religious practice, whether, I mean, Gautam Ghosh is very interesting, has a very interesting paper on Kuldevatas in the context of East Bengali Hindu refugees, whether it's in certain food practices, whether it's even just keeping photographs, or just building new relations. I mean, one thing I found very interesting in my fieldwork experience was this family I knew. And they were nostalgic for life in Kashmir. They didn't like the camp. They would say we had a big house and look at us now. And this family moved to Jagti, the new township for Kashmiri Pandits in Jammu. It's just located outside the city. Jagti township at one level looks like an improvement compared to what Purku camp or any of the other camps where there were ORTs. Now it looks like a DDA colony of sorts, you know, like two-room apartments, about 2-3 stories each. And they said that we kind of lost the connections we built in our lives during our time in the camp. So it's like a double displacement of sorts. So you've had to remake home again, not just in terms of a flat, which has its advantages, right? I mean, these new flats have a private bathroom, makes a big difference when you have to use common toilets, values of privacy and so on. But at the same time, you lost old neighbors in 1990, and you lost neighbors that when you had to move from the Purku camp in 2011. Which goes back to the question again. One has to then constantly work towards making home. The question is, how peculiar is this to migrants? How peculiar is this or difficult is this for forced migrants versus anyone else? So that's one thing I find interesting about the question of home. And if you just return to the question of scale, do I consider home as a structure? Do I consider homeland? Do I consider landscapes? I have some work where I looked at a replica of a Kashmiri shrine, and this replica is built in Jammu. And some like the replica because they see it as a way of recovering that which is lost, recreating memories. At the same time, others would say you cannot recreate the landscape or the environment that is lost because that is only possible, say, in the Kashmir Valley. You can't do it in Jammu. I mean, it's not meant to be a kind of negative take. It's just about what is. But, you know, you still work at making home.
Thank you. So my next question would be, on the specificity of migration within South Asia, because you've talked about the tension between individual families and, the logic of the nation state. So could you elaborate on that?
Okay, the specificities are, let me just get into this, the point about how we look at migration. And this is a point I owe a lot to scholars like Lisa Malky and Nigel Rapport. How do we define communities? How do we define a society? Most of the classic scholarship, especially in anthropology and sociology, looks at people sited in a place. So, for example, take Argonauts of the Western Pacific, right? Go Malinowski. It's the Trobriand Islands. So there's a place called the Trobriand Islands. Take Hemant Srinivas's work, and you go to Rampur. In that sense, a lot of our understanding of community, of human collectives, of society, is premised on an idea of place. We place people. Place becomes definitive of community. Lisa Malky takes this also further by pointing out that there's a logic where we map the world according to place, and we use an arboreal logic. And you know that line, where are your roots? Where are your roots? So we root people into place, and of course, the modern world is defined by the fact that we root people into a fixed piece of land that's determined by the nation state form, right? Some scholars like Lisa Malky Hens and others like Nigel Rapport, and quite a few years ago, there was this collection of essays put together by Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson, well, they would say that actually maybe it's movement that determins human life and collectives. I mean, they were writing in the context of, Lisa Malky's work was in refugees. The others were writing in the context of globalization. Arjun Appadurai's work on the idea of scapes and so on and so forth in modernity at large. And there was a search then that it's actually migration and movement that determined forms of community. And the challenge is to track how this movement happens. So that is the tension. So there's this fundamental tension between rooting people or seeing people in place, and that includes by governments, that includes by the nation state form, that includes nationalist ideologies, but social scientists are pretty complicit in it themselves. Are participants in it in a way, even to some extent. I'm looking at the Kashmiri Pandits. Who are the Kashmiri Pandits? They're the Hindu minority of Kashmir, and they're tied to the Kashmir Valley. There is this, I can mark out the land, even though most of them now live outside Kashmir. So there is this tension. So do I either look at them in terms of place, or do I look at people being lost in a world of movement. The thing about individuals and families, though, I also bring in here is this. You may be affected by a major event of dislocation, whether it's, let's say, you've been made a refugee by the partition, or, you know, you got displaced when the conflict breaks out in Kashmir, and so on and so forth. You could be displaced from your homes because of earthquakes and disasters. You might leave your home. You might effectively be displaced from your home because there's no job, so you need to look for work. But we embody a lot of very complex stories within our own narratives of movement. The nation state becomes a bit of a problem because the nation state looks in terms of collective. So you're trying to establish one single overarching narrative of why you've moved and have you moved the correct way and where you belong. Do you belong somewhere else and somewhere fixed? And I think that's an issue. That's what I mean, is this tension of it. We ourselves as individuals and members of families or even communities at large embody complex stories of movement, and especially in a world marked by movement, but the nation state form may not always recognize that. And rather it is a form that's dedicated, even, there's this wonderful piece by Jonathan Spencer when he looks at Sri Lanka to speak about South Asia, where any kind of system of governance is really looking at putting people in place, even though people have just been moving around a lot. But my concern is, again, I'm not trying to over-valorize movement as well. It's a tension between the two, rather than trying to either fix it or trying to say we're a bunch of floating cosmopolitans in that sense. We're somewhere between the two. Yeah.
So your work on Kashmiri Pandits contrasts nostalgia for life in Kashmir with experiences of trying to re-establish social and political relationships after displacement. We want to know what role, the stories play in shaping ethnographic research.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. Okay, so part of it comes out of an interest I have in, well, at least I had at the time, was in the sort of the anthropology of memory. Though I didn't really end up doing that kind of work in memory studies to the extent I thought I would, various reasons. But nostalgia was something I couldn't ignore to some extent, because it would come up in a conversation about, it could come up in terms of, the weather in Kashmir is so much better, the water in Kashmir is so much better, life in Kashmir was so much better. I mean, part of it was also that sense of loss, right? I mean, you've lost, let's say, a home and you've moved to somewhere new, some place that's not yours. I saw it this way. See, nostalgia as an idea is first sort of documented, if I'm not mistaken, as a kind of malady. So it was kind of seen as people who were ill, even though they seemed biologically fine. I mean, there's this wonderful paper by Katie Stewart on nostalgia. But the idea was of these Swiss guards who, serve at the Vatican as, and they seemed ill, even though they seemed fine. But it was like, oh, they missed their homes. They were nostalgic. So nostalgia is often seen as a kind of malady. I mean, nostalgia can be nice, and nostalgia can have a kind of problem. But what I found interesting when we think about nostalgia is, first, because we see it in terms of it was seen as a kind of malady. We see it as tied to senses of well-being and ideas of a good life. So actually, nostalgia serves as a model of what life ought to be. In this case, it's based on, this is what life used to be in the past. The present is what life is, but really life ought to be like something in the past because the past was better. There are debates about this. You can even ask, was life in the past better? I mean, that's a different story. But what a discussion of nostalgia first comes up because people would keep talking about it. The weather in Kashmir was better, food was better, people were better, and all of that kind of stuff as compared to their present. In fact, if you read some of these kind of memoirs that have come out, I used to find this in conversations, but if you also see them in memoirs by Kashmiri writers like Rahul Pandita, or if you see this novelist Siddharth Gigu who made a film, there is this kind of sense of people feeling completely out of place when they came to Jammu. That the people were different, the language was different, the weather was different, we don't even know how to deal with such a strong sun, it's an arid climate and so on and so forth. So there is this play, but what I find interesting is that it ultimately brings into a kind of engagement between time, different types of points in time. When I'm dealing with nostalgia, I'm in the present, I'm thinking about the past, but I'm also trying to figure out something on what to do towards the future. One kind of nostalgia is my back is turned to the future. I mean, it's not a kind of Angelus Novus, which Benjamin writes about. But it talks about this relationship ultimately of time at one level. I'm looking at the past, and that influences how I look at the present. And it ultimately speaks to values of the good life. The good life may not have existed in the past in practice. It might be better in the present, but it may not have been great then. Or for some people, it was fantastic. That requires the work of a historian. But it speaks about how ultimately we value the good life and how we value well-being. So narratives of nostalgia would come up. They don't come up neatly all the time. But I often found if you talk to people, a lot of them would talk about the past, a certain generation especially that grew up in Kashmir, who led lives in Kashmir in one kind. And I think the question of generation becomes very interesting here. Those who spent life in Kashmir and knew what it was, and now that it's gone, they're most acutely aware of this. You have those who were children at the time of displacement, and so they have an idea of Kashmir, even though they'll spend most of their lives outside it, but you have this idea of this is perfection. It sometimes acquires a mythic value as well. What I find interesting now about nostalgia is to look at the generation that was born after 1990, or especially the generation that came of age outside Kashmir in displacement, or so to speak, and how they now look at the past. One way of looking at it is this kind of mythic, deep past, which you have, this is the Kashmir of Kalhana, and, Kalhana's Kashmir of the Rajatarangini and the idea of the Kashyap Rishi. But these are, of course, a mythic past. But for me, again, any conversation on nostalgia is ultimately a discussion about ideas of how you value life and how you understand well-being. But I think what it now needs is a more fine-tuned discussion of how each generation thinks about nostalgia. But like I said, nostalgia may not be a very neat narrative. I mean, there can be one narrative which is written in newsletters about, the verdant fields and how we had a lovely time and so on and so forth. There could be the other flip side of nostalgia when you can rework it into a history of, or a memory or a myth of conflict. And again, what does that tell you then about aspirations of the present and the future? It can come neat. It can also be like someone just remembering. Like I remember I was with someone who saw the clock. It was 4 o'clock. And he said, if I was in Kashmir at this time, I'd be in my orchards overseeing fruit picking. And here I'm sitting unemployed. And it is this play of contrast we work with. I mean, it's actually in some levels, I think what's interesting about nostalgia is that it is a universal phenomena. Individuals are often caught up in it. You can even say that some societies are caught up in it. There's a whole industry of nostalgia, which you find. The question is, how do I locate nostalgia in relation to generation, power, and perhaps a context that generates nostalgia? With forced migration, of course, or with violence and conflict, there is a sense, again, of loss. And can I recover loss, what I have lost? So, yeah.
Yeah, so, there are some terms that you use in your work, such as migration as a rite of passage. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really my ideas, but I do use this. It goes back to sort of the early work, of Victor Turner, right? I mean, there's a rite of passage to arrive from one point to another, and there's this, your life goes through certain rites of passage. So some scholars writing on migration, not necessarily in forced migration, have used this. So, I mean, two people I can think of are Alpa Shah and Jeevan Sharma, who write about migrants in Jharkhand and Nepalese migrants coming to India, where to migrate is a rite of passage. You do it to move from one stage of life into another. So all these guys who leave as sort of still children, and by migrating somewhere else for work, you become men. In that sense, migration results in a kind of changed state. This is the case with all migrants, right? I mean, even if you're someone from, let's say, Let's say someone who studied engineering gets a job in the United States and moves from India to the United States. It's a changed state. You're moving to another stage in your life in every way, and you're not going to be the same. With refugees and forced migrants, Lisa Malki uses this in a very interesting way, where refugees are in a position. Remember, if you go back to the old studies of the ritual process, where you look at Victor Turner, or more accurately, if you look at Van Gennep's work on ritual, there's this process of liminality. And what is one of the features of liminality? To be neither here nor there. This idea of being neither here nor there. Refugees are especially caught in that liminal position because you've left your homeland or wherever you're from, and you've gone somewhere else, but you don't belong. You might be in a camp, which is even worse, right? Because you're sequestered away. So you neither belong back home because you left because you were, targeted for some reason, and you're now somewhere else where you don't belong as well. That phrase, na gharka, na ghatka. See, if you go back to, Victor Turner's work, liminality is a state we all go through, right? School children are liminal. You're moving from one state before you enter the real world, and there's this positional liminality you go through. Any kind of ritual process involves that. For forced migrants, you're sometimes, especially with refugees, perhaps more than internal displaced people, in that sense, when it comes to citizenship, you're thrust into a perpetual state of liminality. So migration becomes a rite of passage of one state of being into another. You're no longer what you used to be. And if you're a refugee, you might not get citizenship, but you're no longer what you used to be. That's how I use it. It's not an idea necessarily. It's an idea I find that works when you think about migration. But other scholars, like I mentioned before, Al Pasha and Jeevan Sharma, and a lot of guys who look at labor migration have pointed out that some may want to participate in migration because it's a way of breaking out of one stage of life into another. Think about. On a more benign example would be when you leave home to go to study somewhere else, right? Let's say you've lived at home, you've lived with your family, and you've got admission to JNU, which means, and if you're not from Delhi, it means you go there, you live in a hostel, you're entering in many ways the real world. So you're leaving the life of your family, and you're moving on to the world on your own. You might return to your family, but you're not going to return as the same. And you will want to do that, right? Because you want to learn, you want to become something else. So that's a more benign aspect. The trouble with forced migration is that a lot of refugees especially might end up being in a state of perpetual liminality. You neither belong here nor you belong there. So that's how I would see it. But it's also interesting to see how classic anthropological knowledge can actually be implemented in this. You don't need, how classic anthropology is actually still very useful. So yeah.
Okay. So a related question that there has actually been, considerable anthropological questioning of how ideas of territorial rootedness of culture and communities operate. And the Kashmiri Pandits themselves have been a mobile group.
Yes.
So you write that the Pandits may share a history of migration, but the people that you worked with presented themselves as people who are not travelers. They are people who had homes and well-settled lives in the past, but who have been forced to migrate. So while the divide between movement and fixity of place is a political methodological construction, it is also perhaps necessary to consider whether the societies and groups that anthropologists study adopt a sedentary metaphysics themselves. So what do you mean by this? Could you explain a little?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Well, I'll go back to a point I made earlier about this tension in how we imagine societies as either rooted, fixed in place, or as defined by movement. And even social scientists have actually been complicit in this kind of discussion. At one level, I see migration as defining the world. You're trapped in a world of movement. But it's a very simple point. Do people themselves recognize or feel comfortable in being in a world marked by movement and being in a world marked by uncertainty, even if their lives are objectively marked by that? So that was just a basic point I was trying to make, that even as so even if I leave aside the old way of viewing life, and if I take the kind of work of scholars about how it is migration that defines the world, I still have to see how people consider that. Is it an ideal they long for? I mean, this is a point I'm also quite, I would say I've drawn this scholar who's done a lot of work on displacement as well, a guy in Kibre, who points out that ultimately to travel and move is not an easy thing, even if people are doing it, right? You have visa laws, you have borders. It's one thing, okay, it's one thing to be mobile if I am a well-paid company executive, if I'm someone highly qualified, and if I have a legal visa. It's one thing if I travel like that. It's one thing if I travel like a very successful actor, you know, who has money to burn, and I know I will be received with some joy. It's another thing to travel if I was, say, a Rohingya, where I'm fleeing to save my life, and I might end up in a place and they might send me back. At least they might not let me come on land. They might push the boat out. Or even if they let me in, I'll be put in incarceration in some form. And I think that's the struggle. In the end of the day, while movement determines life, people may not like the idea because not everybody can travel equally. I mean, one needs a much more nuanced way of looking at how movement determines social and cultural life. I mean, there's this work on vernacular cosmopolitanism, where Vinay Gidwani and Keshav Ramakrishnan talk about this a lot. And they will look at people who might be from the village, they might have a job in another town, their children might be in another town, and you're moving through a circuit of all of these places. And you're moving through that circuit very easily. And you could even do it outside metropolitan spaces, right? I mean, there's a lot of very interesting work on labor migrants that actually is taking place outside Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Calcutta, Madras, and all, Chennai, and all these places. Rather, you should start looking at small towns. And there's this constant flow of people that happens. But again, you have to look at the conditions and the possibilities and the sense of security that while I'm moving through all these places, I might live in a village, I have my village house, and I'm working in that town, but that's because I have a job with, let's say, State Bank of India, and that's transferred me there, and it'll transfer me again, I'll move somewhere else. It's still fairly secure. Or let's put it this way. I mean, all of this was written and all this work was done before. Think about this COVID-19 pandemic in India. And think about the lockdown, and think about the fact that one of the biggest events in this lockdown was the mass migration of, you know, for the want of a better phrase, what we call labor migrants, from the cities back to the village, and the kind of conditions they had to travel back home. They couldn't sustain in the city because they had no support, and you had to take your chances on foot. How do I look at movement in that way? I mean, everybody loves the idea of footloose labor. I mean, capital loves it. We all like the idea of being footloose, but being footloose is also not an easy thing. And that's why I'm also talking about the Kashmiri Pandits in this sense in my work. While they are part of a world of movement, I mean, their families who are in Jammu, those who are well-to-do, send their children to Delhi and wherever. So you're now part of this larger world of movement. Some can afford it better, some don't. But there is still this desire for some kind of certainty, even if it's not achieved. So I think it's one thing to talk about the nation state trying to root people in, but what do individuals also see? I think that's an essential issue. It also goes back to the question. I mean, we all encounter it. I'm sure you guys encounter it. You know, where are you from? You might not even be where you're from for a long time. I like to say I'm from Bombay, though I actually ought to say I'm from Calcutta. But I also know that I'm not someone, you know, I have a job that's still relatively secure in Delhi. I have a comfortable life. My relatives and family have a comfortable life. It's a very different story if I was like these labor migrants who left the cities with the lockdown this year, partly because they did not have a sufficient base to keep them safe in the city. I mean, there are also studies that pointed out a lot of people didn't leave the city because they had nowhere else to go. I mean, there's some study on a slum where they came to the city because they sold off all their land. So ultimately, some relationship to place still cannot be disregarded. Rather, what we need to consider in this kind of toss-up between defining people by place and defining people by movement is to see power and inequality and how that shapes this imagination and practice. So that's how I'd see it. And I mean, the Kashmiri Pandits talk about it, whether it's about home or whether it's about homeland. And I mean, in the end of the Kashmir is in the news, right? It is the sign of a major, it remains the site of a major conflict in that sense.
So finally, the question to you is, could you throw some light on, your experiences of doing ethnography with Kashmiri Pandits? What are the challenges probably,
Right.
that you faced?
Oh, thank you. See, I mean, all ethnographic research has some kind of challenge. I mean, I have friends who say work, I mean, I know people who've worked in the Kashmir Valley, so they'll work in Srinagar. So they've done work in the context of lockdowns and crackdowns. Jammu wasn't violent in that way, so I didn't have to worry about that. Or people I know who worked on Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, because you were looking at a place where violence was always in the air. For me, one challenge in terms of doing research and thinking about the Kashmiri Pandits actually comes out of the location the Pandits occupy, the political location. And what do I mean by that? See, how does one talk about the Kashmiri Pandits? And I think that is something that has not been sufficiently engaged with. I mean, there are people constantly writing about it. You have a lot of Kashmiri Pandit writers now, and who've been writing about it for a while. See, 1989, 1990, you have the start of what's called the Kashmir conflict. And it's seen as a matter of surprise, though those who work on Kashmir, whether from political science and history, would say that this was kind of in the making for a long time. But the mass displacement of the Pandits, or I mean, you could call it mass displacement, you could call it an exodus, did take a lot of people by surprise. I mean, you are looking at almost most of the entire population of the Pandits, the Hindu minority of Kashmir, leaving the valley to places, to making an exit south. It happened, but there are two kinds of theories that explain it. One theory, which is that the Pandits were targeted because of their faith affiliation, because they were Hindu, and because they were identified with the Indian state. That's one theory that's put forth. The other is that it is a machination of the Indian state and the governor of the time to make the movement for Azadi look bad. And I think the problem that has happened is that a lot of the discussion among Kashmiri Pandits, whether it's even political or an academic, remains caught between these two polarities. And that is something one has to navigate and negotiate to some extent. I mean, I focused on what was the ethnographic present then. So I was looking at life in Jammu. But I think that itself lends a kind of complexity to the narrative. I mean, there needs to be a study as to why they left. I'm all for it. There needs to be some investigation in that sense, or some understanding and engagement. But as a result, it's kind of also locked between two political polarities. The flip side is that this has, as a result, led to a kind of replication of liberal left versus right-wing politics, which we see in India now. And again, the Kashmiri Pandits are kind of caught into that. So we are now seeing the Kashmiri Pandits being spoken of as a way of, if you talk about, let's say, criticisms of the Indian state in Kashmir, it'll be followed by with, what about the Kashmiri Pandits? As a rhetoric. I mean, no one really answers it. That's one thing. So that's one puzzle. I mean, at the end of the day, there is this strange thing about where we keep talking about the Kashmiri Pandits, right? We keep hearing about the Kashmiri Pandits. We talk about them. We seldom actually get to hear what the Pandits have to say. And again, this is not really peculiar to the Kashmiri Pandits. I mean, you see this in a lot of populations. You see this for all Kashmiris, for that matter, right? If you're sitting in India, there's a lot that's written about Kashmiris, and Kashmiris are like this, whether you're Pandit or Muslim. But what do they actually have to say? And that is something that is still, I mean, they're still not being listened to. Whether you're Pandit or Muslim, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's the feeling I have. There is a surge of a lot of work on the valley, at least coming in anthropology and sociology, and some really exciting work. So maybe, hopefully in the future, this will change. I mean, a lot of, I can think of scholars like Aparajita and Mahmoud Junaid and Monapan and Hili Dushinsky and these guys. I mean, there's a lot of historians who are doing a lot of this work. I'm speaking about academics, frankly speaking. I mean, there is a lot of other writing that's constantly done on Kashmir by Kashmiris. I mean, if you think about Rahul Pandita, you think about Siddharth Gigu, I mean, you could also think about Basharat Peer and Mirza Wahid, and there's a lot of this stuff. But in academia, I think that seems to be very exciting with a lot of this kind of work coming out from Kashmir. And when I talk about Kashmir, by the way, I'm talking about the valley. I'm not really talking about Jammu and Kashmir in that sense. I'm not talking about Jammu, nor am I talking about Ladakh here, though they are areas that are relevant to consider. But it is that replication of this difficulty of political polarities. And I think that clouds any kind of discussion on the pundits. That's one thing. The other point, though, and this is something I find interesting, and I write about this in my book, is that the Kashmiri pundits are interesting to think about. There's a kind of anthropological curiosity about them, right? They're the Hindu minority of Kashmir. They're all Saraswat Brahmins, right? So you're not just looking at Hindus, you're looking at Saraswat Brahmins, hence upper caste. They're largely associated with, clerical professions, the bourgeoisie. They're associated with the middle class. So either they are middle class or they're aspirationally middle class. So there is this history and impression and an image of them that they're elites in some ways. So as a result, they are victims, but they're sometimes seen as privileged victims. In Jammu, in my experience then, maybe this has changed now. I mean, this was some time ago. They were recipients of a relief program. And first of all, the name for anybody displaced by conflict in J&K was migrant. So there was already this problem, right? So, oh, you're here to work on migrants. Oh, we're migrants. And then I remember being told by Kashmiri Pandit, well, you're a migrant. You came from Bombay and you've come to Jammu. I mean, I'm a migrant, but our histories are very different. So, and I agree, there is that problem there. Though, again, the term migrant is often used in displacement studies in India since the partition. I mean, Abhijit Dasgupta has written a wonderful review of that in his book. But the flip side is they are migrants. They do have some special recognition of relief from the state. So at that time, they were then hence seen as privileged victims. One is, aspirational middle class Brahmins, plus they were getting, they were the bureaucrats and they were the landowners in Kashmir. There's that kind of narrative that circulates. Then in Jammu, they were getting relief. They were getting money and food aid. And there's a quota for the Kashmiri Pandits in colleges in Maharashtra, which has a fairly long, complex story. So these aren't victims. These are victims, but they're privileged victims. And that became a very interesting thing to try and unpack and discuss. How does one then talk about Kashmiri Pandit victimhood when the larger discourse already paints them as privileged and elite? Some are privileged, some are elite, some are well-to-do, but a lot of them are not. When I look at people in the camp, I would actually see, lives that seem to be fairly dead-ended, lives that may not be the worst off. I mean, by and large, literacy levels are fairly high for them and so on. But I wasn't really seeing elites in that sense as well. I mean, so I think there is a history of being an elite, but I think that also needs to be further complicated. And also recognize with the fact that we are looking at displaced people. And at the end of the day, this discussion of Pandits being seen as privileged victims was circulating in Jammu by ostensibly people with whom they'd be on the same side politically, or so it's imagined. But like I said, the problem we often seem to have in all of these discussions is that it is about Kashmiri Pandits, but one never really heard what they had to say. I mean, we do listen to a few of them, but we don't actually get to listen to the wide spectrum of what the Kashmiri Pandits have to offer. And this goes back again to the larger problem of the Kashmir conflict, where we tend to talk about Kashmiris. We hear what a few of them have to say, but we don't listen to the wide spectrum and the range of ideas that they have to actually share, discuss, and offer. So that's one thing I would say to that. So that's one difficulty that's remained analytically for me as well. And this again ties into another thing. So one of the fun things about doing fieldwork in a city like Jammu is that you're not looking at a metropolitan space, but you're looking at a very mixed population. So it is a city that actually has its own cosmopolitan ethics in a way as well, even if we're not using that term, cosmopolitanism. It's actually a wonderful place to do research if you want to look at the cosmopolis outside the metropolis. So it's a multi-ethnic environment. So you are looking at the Pandits as one part of a mosaic in a city. And hence you look at them, you know, you have to be aware. Even if I'm focused on the Pandits, I'm trying to think about the larger city. But at the same time, there is another issue that comes up, which is that how do I talk about an experience of violence of one community in an area where every other population has some experience of violence? I mean, let's not forget. I mean, you have violence in the valley, which Kashmiri Muslims face, which is of one kind. The Kashmiri Pandits have faced violence and they face another kind of suffering of another kind. If you go in the mountain areas, it's a different story in Doda, Poonch and Rajouri. If you're on the borders where, you know, you're facing the violence of warring armies, it's a different story as well. So how does one talk about these? How does one talk about one story in a region marked by some kind of, where everyone's marked by some kind of violence and suffering? So that's one of the things. The other point I'll just make very quickly is there's a thematic issue as well that has another problem, and I'm trying to still think about this analytically. A lot of the discussion on forced migration, at least in India, is still prefigured by the partition. And there is this overwhelming, you know, I mean, for obvious reasons, either we're looking at everything through the frame of partition studies or through the frame of development-induced displacement, you know, Narmada displacements. I mean, I remember when I first presented my work as a student, you know, these student seminars and you present it, and a friend of mine said to me, like, okay, I mean, you know, nice. How different is what you're presenting from what Bengalis and Punjabis faced in 47? You know, when they landed up in Delhi and Calcutta, you know, it's the same thing. And I find that very interesting as well, that we have a pre-existing language of refugeeness and suffering, which kind of prefigures any other kind of conversation. And maybe it will be interesting to revisit the discussion and discourse of forced migration, violence, and suffering now, at this stage. So I would say this, and just one last point. I mean, for me, it was also interesting because the work I did in the Pandits, which is what I've lived off, the field work itself, that was my first proper experience of doing any kind of research on my own. I remember landing up in 2005 at Jammu railway station. I'm not from Jammu and Kashmir. I knew no one. I had one phone number, someone who I'm still in touch with and who helped me out immensely, gave me lots of advice, but that's about it. So it was a challenge to try and build everything from scratch. And I mean, it's interesting because I've often been asked, like, are you from J&K or do you have a parent from J&K? I had no connection to anything to do with Jammu or Kashmir. It was like taking a card out of a hat and landing up there. Built everything, whatever I did was from scratch, and that itself was great. That was a great experience, but it was not easy. One had to learn very quickly. And learn on the job, and also learn to build relations. I mean, Jammu and Kashmir is a region that's still pretty misunderstood by and large across India. I remember I went back home to Bombay once and went to see a doctor, and you know, when the doctor asked me where I was, I said, oh, I was in Jammu, and they said, oh, how's the snow? And I said, it doesn't snow in Jammu. I mean, simple little things like that, you know, or and it's an experience that still affects me, and it still keeps me preoccupied in terms of my thinking about larger themes in anthropology and sociology. And I find myself still writing about it and thinking about it and being troubled by what's happening as a scholar and as just a person.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Datta, for taking time out and talking to us today. It has been absolutely, wonderful and enriching listening to you. And I'm sure, the students and young scholars who come and watch this video, whenever it's up, are going to learn a lot. So thank you again for talking to us today.
Thank you, Deepali. Thank you, Rituparna, for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. Great questions, and it was good fun to talk. Thank you.
Thank you.